Welcome to Xavier Health at Xavier University, and welcome to the March 3rd Thursday Lunch and Learn webinar. My name is Marla Phillips, and I'm the Director of Xavier Health. The goal of our Lunch and Learn series, for those of you who might not have joined us in the past, is to advance the awareness of driving forces that you manage every day so you can lead with wisdom that would otherwise take a career to gain. We are basically bringing topics to you that you normally don't think about and can increase your awareness of factors that impact your organization and influence the work you do each day, but sometimes from a distance. So I'd like to point out that the Lunch and Learn series is just one of the programs we lead. I hope you can join us for our upcoming Lunch and Learn session in April on advancing predictive capabilities in our industry through artificial intelligence. Our device conference that is formally co-sponsored by the FDA, or our Advanced Summit for Combination Products. Now, you might have noticed that I skipped over number 1, and you might think those dates look a little odd because we are in the middle of them. So yes, the FDA Xavier PharmaLink Conference is occurring downstairs from where Michael and I are sitting. Michael Taylor, our speaker today, just presented to the conference attendees, and we wanted to bring his session to you as well. Before I begin, I would like to say that today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website for everyone to access. And we will end with a Q&A session today. So please send your questions to me throughout the webinar as you think of them instead of waiting until the end. You can use the question tab in your GoToWebinar panel to send your questions, and they come directly to us. They will not distract Michael at all. So again, please feel free to send those as you're thinking of them. So with that, I would like to introduce our speaker for today. Michael Taylor is the co-founder and CEO of Schellingpoint, which enables multi-party groups to design and execute sustained growth and change initiatives through alignment optimization. The alignment optimization process developed by Schellingpoint is based on the Nobel Prize winning work of Thomas P. Schelling in the area of game theory. It is because of this work that I have invited Michael to join us today, since he has implemented this process across industries with over 250 organizations, including high-level government agencies. Specializing in the process of alignment management, Michael has been an invited guest lecturer at Wharton and Cornell. So welcome, Michael, and thank you for taking the time to be with us today to share some of your insight on integration, successful practices across industries.
Thanks, Norma. Glad to be here. So
the first question I have for you is, can you explain how the alignment optimization process works?
Yes, Marla, and welcome everybody to this Lunch and Learn session and this discussion of alignment optimization. What I want to do on the first slide here is say that the work you're about to see started initially as a research initiative. We were interested in the area of coordinated action, and why is it that in so many of these multi-party collaborative activities, strategies, mergers, outsourcing contracts, innovation, joint ventures, alliances, in many, many areas, why is it that when we brought very well-educated, very well-meaning, very experienced people together, we weren't always producing the outcomes that the organizations sought? And one of the things that we found in the research very quickly was that this notion of alignment was both central to success, and in fact when people describe lack of success, lack of alignment is often cited as a root cause, and yet it was something that we found from a methodology perspective. The current capabilities were valuable but significantly incomplete. And when it came to alignment, somebody mentioned that if you think about it, it's a bit like oxygen. When you have a group of people, you don't notice it when all the oxygen is there, you're able to function, but as soon as the amount of oxygen starts to drop, you notice that dysfunction starts to occur. And alignment is similar to that. And what we noticed is that the way people have been brought up, ourselves included, the way we've been brought up is to talk about alignment as a binary, as a yes-no. And we talk about, are we aligned? And we'd ask the question, and people would say, well, yes, we are, or no, we're not. And you can imagine the sort of dynamics that produces, because of course people want to say, yes, we are aligned. Marla here next to me might say 8 things. I might agree with 7 of them, but not agree with the 8th. But if Marla asks at the end, so Michael, are you and I aligned on this? Do I say no, because of one item, and I might risk disappointing an important person? Or is it that I say yes because I feel I need to do so, but I don't really think that we are? And what's important is that my actions won't support my statements. So instead, using this notion of oxygen, we proffered that alignment is actually a dynamic characteristic of a group of people, and that rather than being yes we are, no we're not, we created the mathematics derived from the work of Professor Thomas Schelling to be able to measure the degree of alignment of a group of people. Over the last 7 years, we've done this with hundreds of groups, from as small as 4 leaders of a startup venture to 15,100 people across American hospital systems, and in government, federal, state, local, or across all sorts of areas. But the chart you're seeing on the right is that if 100 is complete like-mindedness, we are fully aligned about what we need to do and why and how, and 0 is no one agrees with anybody, essentially, then what's interesting is every group we've ever measured has had an initial degree of alignment between 44 and 83. So we've never met a group that was fully aligned at the level at which action takes place. And the mean there, by the way, is 72. So if anyone on this webinar is listening, if you were to ask your colleagues about how do we feel about our strategy, how do we feel about this merger that's taking place, how do we feel about this outsourcing contract, what I would say is if you bring a group of people together, you're going to have a degree of alignment somewhere in that range. And so that's important because we can now change the question to how aligned are we, and shift the dynamics. One of the things that's important that came out of the work is that when we found, for example, a group had a degree of alignment of 78, we would then inspect the 22 degrees of misalignment and identify what are the key items there with which, if we don't reconcile them, this initiative, this subject, this merger will not be successful. And as we did this, a pattern formed. The first thing is, when we asked people beforehand on these key misalignments, and why is it you think that what they over there are saying or doing, you don't agree with it, you think it's wrong, why is that? And what we noticed is that 95% of the time, the people would make a negative judgment of the other person's intent. Well, she's saying that because she doesn't want to change. He's saying that because he wants to get more budget for next year. So there'd be a very rational and logical judgment made as to why the other person was doing something they didn't agree with. Now, what that does is that sets up politics. That basically says, well, you know, they're doing something, they won't change what they're doing, and therefore I'm going to have to work around them. So what we found in practice, though, is that is just not the case. A lot of the politics that goes on is absolutely unnecessary. The different data is that when we ask somebody, imagine a statement, we are good at this, and somebody said, yes, we are, and somebody said, no, we're not. What we found is when we asked them for their evidence and their reasoning, the person that was saying, yes, we are, hadn't seen things or was aware of things that the person that said, we're not, had experienced. And so this is how you could reconcile and bring the two together. The main culprit in terms of misalignment in business groups, though, is different dictionary. This is where somebody says, we are good at this. Marla says, well, no, we're not, Michael. And it actually turns out that we have a different definition of good and this. So the good news behind this is that actually misalignment that tends to be feared by groups, just the notion, the word misalignment is something that some of you on the webinar here could be thinking, oh, I don't even like this word. It's not a good term to use in our business or our organization. Actually, it doesn't need to be feared. Now, this notion of alignment and misalignment, why? So what? What's the point behind it? Well, if you look to the top right there, the term coordinated action, the business schools that we're involved in and where we teach business leaders and consultants and others in this work, what we basically say is that a leader's and a consultant's responsibility is to create coordinated action around the most valuable goals. That's what our responsibility is to do if we're a team or a program manager or a project leader. And obviously the other side of that is inaction, delayed action, conflicting, unilateral error. Those are the things that compromise coordinated action. So what causes those misaligned activities? What we found on the left-hand side is that there are 4 categories of opinion that every person carries around the subject that determines their action and inaction. First of all, there's the case for action. Do I think we should have done this in the first place? do I agree that we needed to conduct this merger? Whether my view of whether we did or didn't will affect how I go about acting and not acting on the subject. Indicators of success. How do I judge success? How would for me to say we're successful, what does that look like, and what am I going to try and achieve? Unintended consequences. Typically, the informal language that is negative side effects. So I'm concerned that maybe we should have conducted this merger, but it's going to have this negative impact upon these other two programs. It's going to hurt a set of patients. It's going to damage my department. And then the fourth are barriers. This is where very rational, reasonable people, this isn't whining and complaining, this is where people look at something and say, well, yes, we should have done this. Yes, I've got a clear view of what I'm trying to achieve as success. I do have concerns about unintended consequences. We need to stop those occurring and prevent them. However, I see these barriers that will stop us being successful. We can't do this. Last time we tried this, it didn't work. This isn't possible. And this is what people do. They see these things. So those four factors combined, those opinions that we carry around, are driving everything that occurs on the right-hand side. So just to complete this, in terms of what is alignment optimization all about, alignment optimization is about how do we understand the opinions around a particular subject, and how do we understand how those opinions are going to drive action and inaction, and how is that going to result in coordinated action or the compromises. What you're seeing on this chart here is a sort of a two-dimensional view that in the bottom left-hand corner we call them assumptions. So this is where the question is, what was it about the current performance of the organization that led us to feel the need to conduct a merger? What was going on inside the organization that led us to think that we needed to conduct a merger? Or third, what was it that was going on outside the organization that led us to think we needed to conduct a merger? So the case for action can come from one, two, or all three of these areas. The point I want to note is that typically leaders will express 3 to 7 rationale. They'll say, well, we did this merger because, and there'll be 3 to 7 summary statements. What we found is when you ask the actual people who need to conduct the implementation, why do you think it was necessary or not? On average, a group of people will have 30 opinions covering those three areas. And of those 30, they will only as a group align around 6 of them. So in other words, typically a leader walks in and says, this is why we needed to do this, and assumes that everyone agrees with it. In actual fact, we find out that at the start of these projects, 80% of the reasons for why it was done, there's misalignment around it. So that's important because that obviously affects engagement and interest. To the top right-hand corner there, ends and means, we're very focused in mergers on talking about what we're going to do. There's a lot of focus on means. We need to do this, this, and this. Really, the first place is the ends and the outcomes. And again, a similar story. Leaders will summarize success in 3 to 7 sound bites. But if you ask a group of people how they would define success, the people doing it, then you'll typically have about 60-odd opinions, and there'll only be alignment around 15 of them. So clearly, if we're not aiming for the same spot, our view of what actions are appropriate will change, will differ as well. And the third point in the middle is that to get a full understanding of what's going to drive action and inaction and coordinated action, we have to ask people what worries them, what will cause them to stop. This is where there's concerns about, well, we couldn't put a good plan together. Even if we can put a good plan together, we can't execute or we can't sustain. And there what we found is that groups on average will have 61 reasons why it won't be successful. So if you ignore those 61, you'll go telling everybody this is why we're doing it, what you're supposed to do, but they just won't follow through. Because until you remove those barriers and take them off the table, they will resist the activity. So this is the core construct of what alignment optimization is about about understanding what on a personal level is going to drive person's action and inaction towards the merger.
Yeah, if I could just interrupt for a second. I mean, this is fascinating because what you just said, I mean, you could talk about for like 3 weeks. So, I mean, the fact that in the beginning you have these assumptions, you're not I guess, conveying that you feel that leaders need to get consensus, but the fact that you could have all these different opinions on the case for action that the leaders just aren't even aware of it. And you don't need to get everyone's buy-in because you will have people that just don't agree. And that's not, you're not saying that's not okay. What you're saying is they don't recognize the misalignment and they don't communicate effectively what that case for action is. And then at the end, there's a lot of leaders that don't actually communicate that. It's here's what you need to do, go do it.
Yes.
So they don't even know what the ends are. So you're talking about a leader that communicates the ends, and there's still 67 different opinions about what that actually means. But there's a vast majority of leaders that don't even communicate that. And there's also a lot of leaders don't want to know what the barriers are. Like here's the case for action, here's the ends, make it happen. So if they just went through the process of recognizing that there are real constraints, and as you said earlier, it's not whining, it's like there are constraints, acknowledging them, and then putting an action plan in place to address them, it'd actually be setting themselves up for success. So just even spelling it out this way and seeing that we have to address all of these areas would make the whole, whatever you're implementing, more successful.
I can summarize that up, Marla. You're exactly right by saying that right now, under current methodologies, merger and acquisitions are working from a valuable but incomplete set of opinions. And this, as you can see, is how do we actually surface a complete set of opinions so that we can be working from that, so that we can be working from data, from greater data. That's right.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Okay. So the next question I have is, what trends of obstacles and successful practices have you observed across industries as organizations work to align on strategies, goals, and expectations?
So what I wanted to do is I wanted to respond to this through 3 case studies. And so the first case study here, this is 2 banks, so another regulated industry. And this was a situation where we received a call about 5 months in from one of the CEOs who said it's just not going the way we were expecting it at 5 months in. And what was essentially happening was that the acquirer was judging the acquired business as having misrepresented what they were buying, and as having basically a product that wasn't as saleable, or a set of products or services that weren't as saleable as they originally thought. Where that came from was that the business development personnel for the acquiring bank went out to their customers and said, look, we've acquired this other party, we're going to integrate the 2 of us, but do you want to buy the new products and services ahead of time? And unlike earlier years or earlier acquisitions where they said yes, this time they were saying, no, we'll wait and see. We'll wait until we get the integration. So the business development people from the acquiring bank came back and said, this thing isn't saleable. People don't want to buy it. We found out through this surfacing, by the way, this group, the 16 leaders, the 2 banks that were running this post-merger integration, that they had 154 unique opinions across this whole judgment of what's a successful merger. And it turned out that actually what was going on was that because they'd gone out previously to sell into acquired products, but had not followed through well on the integration, the customers this time were gun shy and were saying, you know what, when you actually do the integration, then we'll buy it. So it was actually their fault, not the acquirers. The other thing that was going on that was compounding this was that they'd done their own due diligence, and they had missed things. They had assumed that they were capable of conducting an effective due diligence. They hadn't. So when they were coming to the integration, there were things that were going on that were, because they weren't working very well, they said to the acquired company, well, you didn't tell us about this, and this is your reason why it's not working. So what that was doing, of course, is that was causing the integration to take longer, which, of course, was compounding the sales issue. Ultimately, what came out of this was a heart-to-heart conversation with the entire group of 16 that said, look, the real issues here are the acquired company. You have customers that don't trust you yet, and you're the ones that didn't do all the due diligence. So let's just accept that and now get on with solving it and now bring it to the table. The second example I want to talk about is 2 software companies. This is more of a positive conversation. This is where we measure the degree of alignment starting in month 1 and going into month 2, where the question was amongst everybody, how do we optimize the post-merger integration to maximize the efficacy? And that engaged everybody bringing their opinions to the table. That surfaced many barriers, concerns whether there'd be consequences, misalignments around ends as well as means. And in month 2, resolved and reconciled those. And then every 4 months for 2 years, we asked that question again. Because what happens with alignment is it drifts. And in that case, we were able to then catch the drift every 4 months and make sure it stayed online. This example here, the pharma companies, more to your area, obviously I can't mention the name of the pharmaceutical companies, but this is where we were asked 9 months in to a customer integration where, again, it wasn't going well. There was a supply chain transformation that, quite frankly, was not achieving any of the metrics. To cut a long story short on that was that there'd been a supply chain transformation strategy put in place, but the implementation wasn't occurring. There was a lot of resistance. And it turned out, through the analysis of all of the opinions, that many of the managers and vice presidents in both mainly in the acquired business, but also some of them in the acquiring business, did not believe the business case behind some of the changes. When the consulting firm that conducted this supply chain strategy design with the SVP of supply chain was asked to justify all of the changes and just show the evidence of the business cases, they couldn't on half of them. So basically what happened there was that the fundamental assumptions behind the acquisition, many of them were just, well, this is the right thing to do rather than there's a valid business case behind it. And so a lot of those projects were stopped, and they were stopped, and some of them never occurred, and others started again when a business case was put in place to judge them. The point I want to make about this is, I didn't set this up properly in the prior one about the software company, but the common thing that we see is we don't see many mergers. We see a lot of acquisitions. And in those acquisitions, we see very often the acquirer judging the acquired firm as having broken promises or overset expectations, and rarely are things the fault of the acquirer. And then a common pattern we find is that that is not the case, and that a lot of the root issues are just are in this misunderstanding of expectations, the case for action, the business case, which then leads to downstream problems during the action phase later on.
Okay, great, thank you. So what can the pharmaceutical and medical device industries do to prevent misalignment and maintain alignment throughout the relationship life cycle?
Well, I think that's really the that's the learning sort of that comes out of all of this at this point, is that the thing that we notice is that post-merger integration is very much treated as a program. You see the Gantt chart there as the image on the left. These are complex B2B programs involving hundreds, thousands of people, and we run them as a set of actions. But they were conducted in the first place because of business outcomes. But what we notice is that once we sign the contract and we start moving into implementation, the notion of the ends and the outcomes, the focus is lost, and the focus really moves on to how we've done it. And what we see too often is leadership teams and others declaring success as in the merger is now complete, the acquisition is complete, because they're looking at a Gantt chart saying we hit the last milestone and the last task has been executed. And yet what you're left with is when you talk to the personnel, and we're talking here about SVPs, VPs, managers, operators, others, they're sitting there saying, well, you might call this thing complete, but I don't. And here's why I don't feel like it's fully integrated, and here's all the things that weren't done or weren't dealt with, and I don't really feel like one-on-one has stayed free. And so we see the main issue is too much of a focus on action versus a focus on coordinated action, which is, again, this notion of everybody coordinated everything they're doing around a common set of goals. And what goes along with that is this notion of it's a program, it has a Gantt chart, is it done? Is this notion of it's not a particular outcome. It is a life cycle. Just because we're 2 years in and we've done all the tasks of integrating IT, integrating the processes, integrating payroll, doesn't mean to say the integration is over. And we get many of them following these red lines versus the green line, which is where we really want to follow, which is the yes that we're doing this, we're getting success from this. So that the main closure here is that as a leader, I can look at things and say what needs to happen, but at the end of the day, I don't really have a lot of power over what people do and choose not to do. They're going to go their own way when they're sitting in the office or in the site. And so the main thing that you can do when you're talking with colleagues, when you're talking with people in your department, when you're talking about what is going on in your merger or acquisition, is to look at alignment again, not as a binary, but as a how aligned are we? And there's two main levels that you can look at. One is vertical. Do you agree in the first place is why this was done? And do you agree with the goals we're trying to achieve? And horizontal is, do we agree with how we're going about doing it? So if you want me to close up here, for some questions, is what we try and put across to consultants and to business personnel is try and shift from the traditional thinking that we all grew up with, I grew up with as well, where we would run meetings and talk about are we aligned. I'd ask you to, when you leave this webinar, next time you're sitting in a meeting with a set of colleagues, if you're talking about some multi-party activity, just listen to the language around alignment. And to the extent you can change that from are we aligned to how aligned are we around this, that will open up a separate conversation. To the extent as a leader, as a manager, you can get away from, well, have we done this, to also asking, but how are we doing in terms of getting the outcomes we're looking for, which might mean, by the way, actually having outcomes. Very often people are doing things and don't know what outcomes they're really trying to produce from it in terms of metrics. And again, if you can start to look at it from a perspective, yes, we have the actions, but do we have the coordinated action going on that's going to produce those outcomes? And two of the learnings is we're very good at advocating. We're very good at saying as leaders, this is why we did this. This is why it's good for you. This is why you should do this. This is why you should get on board. We're very good at advocating. If you really want to get coordinated action in place, the best thing you can do is ask somebody, why won't it work? Why won't it work? Or how is it going to cause problems to other people if we try and do this? Because if you ask those two questions, then if you allow people to have the safety to say, well, my concern is it won't work for this reason, or it's going to cause these problems, then you can reconcile and mitigate those items, and then people will act. And of course, I don't need to say too much about this, I'm sure you're familiar with this yourselves, is that in terms of the whole language, we need to get away from the us and the you, and every conversation has to be driven around the we and the are, and it's our coordinated action, it's our outcomes, and it's our alignment that we're talking about.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so first of all, thank you, Michael. I mean, it's fantastic to hear the challenges that there are related to mergers and acquisitions. We're seeing it everywhere in our industry, but to see that there's reason behind it and to understand that reason gives us power and empowerment to actually change where we've been heading for so many years. So thank you for sharing that with us. For those of you on the call, we will now start the Q&A portion of the session. So feel free to submit more questions to us through your questions tab on the GoToWebinar panel. And in the meantime, I will ask some questions. So, you know, it's interesting to hear, especially pharma and device and really any industry, you can't take direct learnings from other industries because we're different. It's usually the mentality. It's like, well, you know, we're different, so that we can't apply that. Can you maybe comment on a gauge of how aligned you feel companies are across industries? You know, are they truly so different?
So this is, by the way, Marla doesn't know my answer to this. She just isn't a setup here. So Marla, what's interesting is that you've asked sort of one dimension of a question we're regularly asked. So does a group's degree of alignment differ by industry? Does it differ by nationality? You know, will it be different in India or England and Australia and Sweden, etc.? Does it differ by male, female? Based upon several hundred measurements of alignment, No, those are not factors whatsoever. What we find does affect things is the degree to which the subject is a generative subject versus a restorative subject. What we mean by generative is it a group of people coming together to create something versus restore something that's broken. We see a lot lower degrees of alignment in restorative situations, as you might expect. We see a shift. So you'll find if the topic itself is so if you have people that have never been involved in a merger before, and this is their first merger, then they won't be able to express many barriers. But if you have a group that's been involved in multiple mergers, they'll have more barriers to express. So no, we don't find anything, there's no pattern across industry or nationality or anything. It's more to do with the nature of the group of people and the subject and the timing.
Basically the fact that we're all human. Is what it boils down to.
We're all human and we have opinions.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So you, one question related to the mergers and acquisitions. You're initially looking at two companies that were separate but are merging. So it seems as though you could use this type of alignment process to look at your own company, perhaps with your suppliers, so companies that you're not necessarily trying to merge with. But can you talk a little bit about how you can use the alignment process with either internally, just within your own company, or across contracts?
So what we're talking about here is that, just to be clear to everybody, we're talking about some subject where a group of people have opinions about that subject. It could be your quality strategy. It could be your sustainability strategy. It could be a business process. It could be how do you innovate something. So the first point is that there's some shared subject that people have opinions around. What we do is you can break them into three types: within one organization, between two organizations, or across many. Between two is an example that is a merger. But at the same time, between two includes customer suppliers, outsourcing contracts, joint ventures, strategic alliances, partnerships. So there are many examples of between two. Now, in those situations, there are three main points of alignment. So if you imagine it as a barbell, then you've essentially got the degree of alignment, I'll say, within the supplier. And that's where you sit down and say, look, your degree of alignment as a supplier in terms of what you need to do to satisfy this customer is 80. And if you don't sort out the 20, you will not satisfy this customer. And then there's the degree of alignment within the customer about what they want from the supplier. And let's say their degree of alignment is 80. And the conversation there is if you don't sort out that 20, no supplier can satisfy you because you don't have alignment around what you want from the supplier. And then the third point of alignment is between the two. This is where it's a case of, well, you seem to think this and they think this. And so, yes, there are many situations going on right this moment where alignment is being measured between two organizations in these 3 points.
Okay, yep. Great, thank you. And there's a couple questions that came in that I'll answer if you don't mind. One is, are the slides going to be available? So yes, they are. Every Lunch and Learn session we've done since we started these last July are posted on the website with the recording and with the slides. So those will be available, and usually we get that done within a day, although we are in the middle of our Pharmalink conference, so we'll do our best. And so then the other question is, can you share again the 3 misalignment items that were on a previous slide? So you will have access to the slide, but the highest area of misalignment was around different dictionary at 60%, the next one different data, which was at 35%, and then the last one said different drivers at 5%. Yeah. Yep. So I'm a big fan of Michael's, as you can tell. So I study what he's talked about. Okay, so for you, there's another question. Per previous results, what are the main barriers to promote change in alignment, behavioral or procedural?
So, being very, very honest in my response, the main issue is that most of these initiatives these days in organizations, people don't like negative talk. And people don't like to ask for the problems. And we, at Schellingpoint, we're working in strategy, mergers, there's 108 different kind of topics where groups get together. And the common pattern is if you really want to generate effective change and coordinated action, yeah, we can talk about why it was necessary. Yes, we can put goals together. But the thing is the willingness to say, why don't you think it's going to work? Why won't it work? And how is it going to cause problems? If there's anything you can do, is stop advocating, or when you've finished advocating, is ask those two questions. And when people share them, even if you think that it is a ridiculous statement, and how could you possibly think that is a problem, for that person, if they think it's a problem, it will cause them to resist or at best comply. And so until you can, so the process we teach is validate and mitigate. So basically, let them express the issue, validate it, and if it's valid, mitigate it. So I can tell you story after story after story. That's the main thing for affecting change, I would say.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question: is there an acceptable or reachable timeline to reach alignment once the effort has started?
So let me express this in a couple of case studies. There was one of the largest 5 pharmaceutical companies. There may be people on the phone from that company at the moment, I don't know. And they wanted to transform drug discovery. And so you can imagine across multiple therapeutic areas, the notion of transforming the drug discovery process was a very interesting conversation with lots of potential for really who want to do that. And so we all flew into the UK on a Monday morning, surfaced all of their opinions from the therapeutic area leadership, and had it measured by 1 o'clock, and found out all of the key misalignments by 3 o'clock. And they walked out at the end of Tuesday night with a set of actions. They went to the board, they got a $90 million budget approval, and they implemented the 18 work streams that led to the change. So for those of you who are familiar with pulling groups of people together to get into meeting rooms and talk about, okay, what are we going to do? This is basically changing how that conversation works, right? So you can spread this conversation out over 4 or 6 weeks, but mainly it's not so much, it actually takes half the time, because basically what you're doing is you're really getting down to very focused, we need to talk about this. So if that's a sufficient answer for people.
Okay, thank you. That's all the questions we have. I just want to point out that so many companies are involved in mergers and acquisitions, and obviously all of the companies are involved in supplier partnerships, where you have opportunities to look at degrees of alignment. So how aligned are you? So thank you for giving us some very actionable learning on how to change our language, how to invite people to share information that will actually help us overcome some of the barriers that are right now under the water. So you don't even know that they exist there, but yet they undermine everything you're trying to do. So, so thank you so much for taking the time to be with us here at PharmaLink and for our Lunch and Learn session.
Thanks, Marla, and to everyone on the webinar, all the best with everything you're doing.
Great, and we'll see everyone on the line next month. Take care and have a great